It was a perfect Saturday afternoon. The sun was shining, the grill was sizzling, and laughter echoed across the backyard as Alex and his friends enjoyed a well-deserved pool party. After weeks of grueling work, Alex had been looking forward to this moment, relaxing with his closest friends, good food, and great music. His backyard was the ideal spot, spacious, clean, and featuring a legally installed pool that he had every right to use. But there was one problem: Heather. Heather was the self-proclaimed enforcer of the neighborhood. As a member of the Homeowners Association, HOA, board, she believed it was her duty to police everyone's actions, even those who weren't part of the HOA. Alex's house had been grandfathered out of the association long before he bought it, meaning Heather had no jurisdiction over him. And that drove her crazy. For months, Heather had made it her mission to make Alex's life difficult. It started with petty emails disguised as friendly neighborhood reminders. Then came the passive-aggressive complaints about things that weren't even violations. His trash cans were too visible, his lawn was a half-inch too high, and his car parked in his own driveway was apparently an eyesore. Alex had ignored her antics for the most part. He wasn't looking for a fight, but he also wasn't about to let some overbearing control freak dictate how he lived in his own home. So, when he planned a small Saturday barbecue and pool party with some friends, he made sure everything was in compliance. Noise levels were kept reasonable, the guest list was limited to close friends and neighbors who didn't mind, and his pool was legally installed. The afternoon started off perfectly. The grill was sizzling, the sun was shining, and laughter echoed across the yard. Alex leaned back in his chair, drink in hand, enjoying the easygoing atmosphere. Then he noticed her. Heather stood at her window, peering through the blinds like some kind of suburban spy. Her lips were pursed so tightly it looked like she was sucking on a lemon. She stood there for a full 10 minutes, watching, judging. Then, with a dramatic huff, she disappeared from view. Alex smirked. He knew exactly what was coming next. Sure enough, 3 minutes later, Heather was stomping up his driveway. She wore her usual uniform of superiority, a stiff cardigan, mom jeans, and a clipboard that Alex was 90% sure she carried around just to look official. She didn't even knock. She just barged through the side gate and marched up to Alex, hands on her hips. "This," she declared, gesturing at the party as if it were a crime scene, "is unacceptable." Alex sighed, already exhausted. "Heather, I'm not part of the HOA. You know that. This isn't about the HOA," she snapped, her voice rising. "It's about community standards. We have rules here. You can't just throw a reckless, disruptive," and she sniffed dramatically, probably illegal gathering in the middle of the day. Alex raised an eyebrow. "It's a small pool party, not a nightclub." Heather ignored him, flipping through the papers on her clipboard. "I have a list of neighborhood policies that clearly state." "Those don't apply to me," Alex interrupted again. "Not in the HOA." Heather's eye twitched. "That pool is not HOA approved." Alex smirked. "Good thing I didn't need HOA approval. I got a permit from the city." For a moment, Heather just stood there, blinking like a malfunctioning robot. Alex could practically hear her brain buffering as she tried to process the fact that she had no power here. Then, just like always, she changed tactics. "If you don't shut this party down, I will call the authorities." Alex exhaled slowly. He could feel the eyes of his friends on him, waiting to see how he would handle this. He glanced at Heather, who stood there with her arms crossed, fully expecting him to cave. He grinned. "Go ahead." Heather's mouth fell open. She clearly wasn't expecting that response. What? "Go ahead and call them," Alex repeated, leaning back in his chair. "I'm sure the cops will love to hear about how a legal gathering is ruining your Saturday." For a second, she hesitated. But then, with a smug smirk, she pulled out her phone and dialed. Alex couldn't believe she was actually going through with it. He watched as she stepped back, speaking loudly and dramatically into the phone as if she were reporting a felony in progress. "Hello. Yes, I'd like to report a disturbance. There's a huge unauthorized party happening right now. Excessive noise, possible violations of zoning laws." She threw in a gasp for effect. "I don't think the pool is even legal." Alex just shook his head. He turned to his friends, who were now watching in amusement. "She just called the cops on a pool party," one of them whispered, barely suppressing laughter. Heather ended the call and gave Alex a victorious smirk. "The police will be here shortly. Hope you're ready for some fines." Alex just shrugged. Sure, Heather. Let's see how that works out for you. 15 minutes later, sirens wailed in the distance. Heather practically vibrated with excitement. Oh, this is going to be good, she whispered, barely containing her glee. Then the squad car rolled up to the curb. 2 officers stepped out, their expressions neutral as they surveyed the scene. One of them, Officer Daniels, approached Alex. We got a call about a disturbance. Before Alex could speak, Heather leaped forward. Yes, officer. Thank goodness you're here. This man is hosting an illegal pool party. It's a nuisance to the entire neighborhood, and his pool, she jabbed a finger toward it, isn't even legal. The officer frowned. He turned to Alex. Sir, do you have paperwork for the pool? Without missing a beat, Alex pulled out a neatly organized folder. Absolutely, he said, handing it over. Permit from the city, zoning approvals, all in order. Also, I have security camera footage if you'd like to check noise levels. And as for a neighborhood-wide nuisance, I think you'll find that most of my neighbors were invited. The officer looked through the documents, then slowly turned back to Heather. Do you realize that filing a false police report is a crime? Heather's smirk vanished. I was just, she stammered, her face turning red. The officer sighed. If this is just a civil dispute, this is not a police matter. You could be facing a fine for wasting emergency services time. Alex folded his arms. And while we're on the subject of breaking the law, I'd love to discuss something else, like trespassing. Heather's face paled. She hadn't expected this to backfire. And Alex? He was just getting started. The fake HOA violation. The next morning, Alex woke up to find a formal HOA violation notice in his mailbox. He held up the letter and read it aloud to his friend Mike, who had stayed over after the party. Dear homeowner, it has come to our attention that you are in violation of HOA community standards. Your recent unauthorized gathering has caused multiple complaints regarding noise, unsanctioned pool usage, and general disruption. You are hereby ordered to cease all non-approved activities immediately or face fines and legal action. Alex snorted. They really think this is going to scare me. Mike shook his head. Dude, you're not even in the HOA. They can't fine you. Alex grinned. Exactly. But it wasn't just about the letter. The real issue was Heather. This wasn't a legitimate HOA decision. It was a personal attack. Heather had pressured the HOA board into sending him this letter, despite the fact that they had no legal authority over his property. Alex wasn't going to let it slide. Uncovering Heather's lies. Alex spent the next 2 hours researching HOA bylaws, city zoning laws, and property ownership records. He wanted proof, solid, indisputable evidence that Heather and the HOA were crossing a line. And that's when he found it, a legal loophole. Alex wasn't just exempt from the HOA due to a technicality in the property records. The HOA had zero jurisdiction over his lot. Better yet, Heather was misusing HOA funds. As he dug deeper, Alex found HOA expense records that didn't add up, mysterious charges, unauthorized fines, even Heather using HOA money to upgrade her own front yard. It was the golden ticket. Heather had been so busy trying to take Alex down that she hadn't realized she was leaving a trail of her own violations. Alex knew exactly what to do next. Setting the trap. Alex drafted a formal response to the HOA, citing all the legal exemptions proving they had no authority over him. He attached copies of the permits for his pool, noise regulations, and a list of his neighbors who had no complaints. Then he did something bold. He announced another pool party. This time, he made sure Heather knew about it. She took the bait immediately. Less than an hour after the announcement, Heather sent another email blast to the HOA board, demanding they take serious action against Alex. But Alex had one more trick up his sleeve, Heather's biggest mistake yet. Heather's obsession. Heather wasn't just sending emails, she was snooping. Alex's security cameras caught her on tape trespassing in his backyard at midnight. She was digging through his trash, taking photos of his pool equipment, even messing with his property. Alex had her, and now he was going to end this once and for all. The fake HOA meeting. The next morning, Alex found another letter taped to his door. Urgent HOA meeting regarding ongoing violations. Attendance required. Alex rolled his eyes. Dude, Mike muttered, looking over his shoulder. She's still at it. Alex chuckled. This is getting pathetic. The letter demanded that Alex attend a special emergency HOA meeting to discuss the issues surrounding his property. The problem? Alex wasn't part of the HOA, and yet Heather had scheduled a meeting specifically for him. That alone was shady. So, Alex decided to go, not because he cared about the HOA's opinion, but because he wanted to see Heather crash and burn. The emergency HOA meeting. That evening, Alex arrived at the HOA clubhouse. Inside, a small group of board members sat at a long table, while Heather sat at the head, looking smug. Alex immediately noticed something odd. Most of the board members looked uncomfortable. They weren't fully on board with Heather's nonsense, they were just tolerating her. Heather cleared her throat dramatically. We are gathered here today to discuss the disturbances that have been caused by Alex's illegal pool and unauthorized gatherings. Alex smirked. You mean my legal pool and completely lawful parties? Heather's eye twitched. That's not the point. We have received multiple complaints. The HOA has decided that action must be taken. Alex leaned back in his chair. Really? Who complained? Silence. Heather shifted uncomfortably. The complaints are anonymous. Alex laughed. Right. Let me guess. You're the only one who complains. One of the HOA board members, Mrs. Lanning, finally spoke up. Actually, we haven't received any official complaints except from Heather. Heather froze. That's not true. I have documents. Alex cut her off. Great. Show us. Heather rummaged through her fake HOA violation papers, but the more she flipped through them, the more obvious it became. She had nothing. Alex smiled. Since we're talking about violations, I actually brought something too. He pulled out his phone, opened the security footage, and cast it onto the large screen behind them. The video played, and there it was, crystal clear footage of Heather trespassing in Alex's backyard. Gasps filled the room. Heather turned pale. Alex let the footage play for a full minute before pausing and looking her dead in the eye. Heather, he said, his voice deadly calm, would you like to explain why you were trespassing on my property at midnight? Heather's mouth opened and closed like a fish. I was just. Alex continued. Oh, and why you were tampering with my pool equipment. More gasps. The HOA board whispered amongst themselves. Heather's plan had completely backfired. Alex turned to the board. Trespassing is a crime. I'd be happy to press charges. Heather jumped up. You wouldn't dare. Alex grinned. Oh, I absolutely would. Heather's meltdown. Heather lost it. She slammed her hands on the table. This is ridiculous. You all just let him get away with everything. Mrs. Lanning folded her arms. Heather, you lied about HOA complaints and broke into someone's property. This isn't about Alex anymore. It's about you. One of the other board members, Mr. Thompson, sighed. Honestly, Heather, we've put up with your antics for too long. You constantly harass homeowners, issue fake violations, and now we see you're breaking the law. Heather turned bright red. You can't do this to me. I'm the one keeping this neighborhood in order. Alex smirked. Not anymore, you're not. Mr. Thompson exchanged glances with the rest of the board. Heather, effective immediately, you are being removed from the HOA board. Heather staggered back. What? Mrs. Lanning nodded. We'll also be conducting an audit on how HOA funds were used over the last 2 years. Heather looked horrified. And Alex? He was enjoying every second. The ultimate payback. As soon as the meeting ended, Alex pulled out his phone. Heather's eyes widened. Wait, what are you doing? Alex's voice was casual. Oh, nothing major. Just reporting a trespasser. Heather gasped. You can't be serious. Alex grinned. Dead serious. He dialed. Within minutes, the same officers from before arrived. Heather's whole body shook as they played back the footage. The officers turned to Alex. Do you want to press charges? Heather looked at him, desperate. Alex thought about it for a second, then smirked. No, I don't think I will. Heather let out a relieved breath. Then Alex added, Yet. Heather nearly fainted. The fallout. Heather was removed from the HOA board, and a full investigation into her misuse of funds was launched. She tried one last move, sending a fake legal threat to Alex. But when Alex looked up the so-called lawyer, it turned out to be a template she copied from the internet. It was over. And Alex? He threw another pool party. This time, the whole neighborhood celebrated the downfall of HOA Heather. Heather, now completely humiliated, put her house up for sale. But there was one problem. No one wanted to live in a neighborhood where Heather had made enemies with everyone. And that was the sweetest revenge of all. The final bait. Alex had one last move to make sure Heather's reign of terror was over for good. He waited. He let her think she had won. And then he announced another pool party. This time, he made sure Heather knew about it. Flyers went up, social media posts were made, and invites were sent out to the entire neighborhood. And Heather? She took the bait instantly. Within hours, she was already ranting in the HOA group chat, sending furious emails, and even going door to door, trying to rally people against Alex. But here's the thing, nobody cared anymore. The HOA board had turned against her, the neighbors were sick of her nonsense, and Alex? Alex was waiting, because he knew Heather was going to break the law again. And this time, she wouldn't be getting off so easily. Heather's biggest mistake. The night before Alex's party, Heather couldn't take it anymore. She had tried everything. Calling the cops failed, fake violations failed, HOA power moves backfired. She had one last desperate option, sabotage. Under the cover of darkness, Heather snuck back into Alex's backyard. But what she didn't know was that Alex had installed extra security cameras. This time, he had multiple angles, night vision, and audio recording. And when Heather crawled through a gap in the fence, her every move was being recorded. She cut the pool pump wires. She tampered with the filter. She poured something suspicious into the water. And then she tried to sneak back out. But Alex? He was waiting. The perfect payback. The moment Heather turned to leave, Alex flipped on his backyard floodlights. Heather froze like a deer in headlights. For a long, tense moment, no one moved. Then Alex smirked. Going somewhere, Heather? Heather spun around. I was just. Alex pulled out his phone and hit play. The security footage showed everything. Heather trespassing, Heather damaging property, Heather committing a literal crime. Her face drained of color. You can't use that against me, she stammered. Alex raised an eyebrow. Oh, Heather, you just committed vandalism and trespassing. Heather tried to backpedal. I was just checking to make sure your pool was safe. Alex laughed. By cutting my pump wires and dumping chemicals into my pool. Heather gasped. That's a lie. Alex smiled wider. No, Heather. That's evidence. And then he dialed the police. Heather's eyes went wide. No, wait, Alex, please. But Alex? He just pressed call. The cops arrive. Within minutes, the same officers from before pulled up in their squad car. And when they saw the security footage, their expressions turned dead serious. Officer Daniels said, "You are under arrest for trespassing, vandalism, and destruction of property." Heather screeched, "This is unfair." The second officer pulled out a pair of handcuffs. "Please turn around." And just like that, Heather was cuffed in her own front yard. Alex leaned against his fence, watching the absolute meltdown unfold. "You can't do this to me," Heather shrieked as they led her to the squad car. "I am the HOA president." Officer Daniels sighed. "You were removed from the board last week." Heather stiffened. She had forgotten about that little detail. Alex smirked. "Guess you're just a regular neighbor now, huh?" Heather was seething. She tried one last desperate move. She turned to Alex, her eyes wild. You set me up." Alex tilted his head. "Oh no, Heather. You did that all on your own." And with that, Heather was shoved into the back of the police car. The door slammed shut, and just like that, Heather was gone. The aftermath. The next morning, Alex woke up to the best news of his life. Heather had been formally charged with trespassing, vandalism, filing false police reports, and the kicker, the HOA was being investigated for Heather's misuse of funds. Alex spent the morning reading hilarious texts from his neighbors. "Bro, we all saw her get arrested. It was beautiful. Did she really think she could get away with it? HOA finally feels normal without her." But the best part? Heather tried to sell her house, and no one wanted it. Why? Because everyone knew she was the neighborhood psycho. She had no choice. Heather moved out. And the neighborhood? It finally became peaceful. Alex threw one last pool party. No cops, no fake HOA violations, no Heather. And as he leaned back, drink in hand, watching the sun set over his perfect Heather-free neighborhood, he smiled. Because in the end, he won. The end. 17.txt. TXT 20.38 kilobytes. Hey Viet Lai Cho Toi Content Nai, Jung Nguyen Y, Noi Dung, Boi Can, Cot Trian, Chin Zach 150,000 to 200,000 2, Thay Doi Tin Nin Vat Trong Ka Chian. Luan Viet Bang Tiang on Chuan My Mot Catch Tu Nien, Dung Ku Fap, Viet Hap Dan Thursday Hut Nuoi Ne, Hey Viet Ca Fan Ket Ka Trian. The fall of Hoa Heather. Heather had always been a pillar of her neighborhood. As a long-standing member of the Homeowners Association, HOA, she took great pride in maintaining the image of the community. In her eyes, the neighborhood was a symbol of exclusivity and order, a place where people followed the rules, kept their lawns neat, and respected the established traditions. It was her sanctuary, and she felt entitled to its preservation, its perfection. Everyone in the neighborhood knew Heather, and by extension, knew her reputation for being involved in everything. Her voice was often the loudest when it came to making decisions about what was acceptable and what wasn't. So, when Marcus, a well-dressed black man, moved in next door, Heather felt the first stirrings of discomfort. She couldn't explain it at first. Marcus wasn't doing anything out of the ordinary. He was simply moving into his new home like any other resident. He had a nice car, was well-spoken, and clearly had money. But that was precisely the issue. Marcus was different from the others. He didn't fit into Heather's narrow view of who belonged in her neighborhood. She found herself scrutinizing his every move. When he hosted business meetings in his home, she couldn't help but feel repulsed by what she saw as a challenge to her sense of order. The fact that Marcus had the audacity to not only exist in her community, but to thrive unsettled her deeply. Heather's discomfort festered. She told herself it was about maintaining the integrity of the neighborhood, but in reality, she couldn't stand that someone like Marcus, someone so confident and successful, had chosen to live so close to her. He wasn't the quiet, passive type of person she had grown accustomed to seeing around her. Marcus was unapologetically successful, and Heather couldn't understand why someone who didn't belong to her inner circle should be allowed to enjoy the same privileges that she, in her mind, deserved. It was an irritation that she couldn't shake, and as time went on, her passive annoyance turned into a more active resentment. Heather began to take note of Marcus's every move. She saw him walking down the street, heading to meetings, or enjoying a stroll with his dog, and every time, it added to the knot of frustration in her chest. She started to create stories in her mind, stories that told her Marcus didn't belong, that he was out of place, that he wasn't the kind of person who should be part of her pristine neighborhood. She watched him from her window, waiting for the moment when she could take action. In her mind, she was protecting the neighborhood's image, but in reality, she was simply being driven by a toxic belief that people like Marcus were a threat to her idea of what the community should look like. It wasn't just about Marcus anymore. It was about a bigger issue, an issue that Heather had built in her head. The neighborhood was hers, and she had every right to decide who could live there. Marcus's presence in her quiet, controlled world was a reminder that she didn't have the same power over everything anymore. She wasn't the only one who had a say in the neighborhood's future, and that realization infuriated her. Over time, her irritation grew, and Heather began to search for a way to force Marcus out, convinced that he was disrupting the balance of the world she had built for herself. The confrontation. One crisp afternoon, Marcus was walking down the sidewalk near his home, dressed impeccably in a sharp suit. He had just finished a meeting with a potential client and was heading out for another important business engagement. His confident stride, the shine of his shoes, and the crispness of his suit sent a clear message. He was someone who took his work seriously. He was a man with ambition, purpose, and success. He wasn't the kind of person who needed to announce his worth because his presence already did that for him. What Marcus didn't realize was that he had once again become the focus of Heather's watchful eyes. She had been sitting in her living room, staring out the window with nothing to do, when she saw Marcus walking by. The sight of him in that suit, with his confident posture, immediately set her off. There was something about him, his presence, that made her stomach churn. He didn't belong here, not in her neighborhood. She was convinced that Marcus, a man with his kind of success and self-assurance, couldn't possibly be someone who fit into the mold she had created for the community. It was as though he was flaunting his success, rubbing it in her face that he could afford to live in the same neighborhood as her, despite not being part of her circle. Heather didn't even pause to think. Her mind was already racing with the idea that Marcus must be doing something wrong. She couldn't articulate why she felt this way, but in her mind, his appearance alone was enough to make him suspect. It wasn't about who he was as a person, it was about the discomfort he caused her. His existence in her world was enough to set off her internal alarms, and that was all the reason she needed. Without a moment's hesitation, Heather grabbed her phone and dialed 911. Her fingers shook with anticipation, and her words came out quickly, her voice trembling with righteous anger. "I see a man walking down the street. He looks suspicious, like he's up to something illegal. I don't trust him. He doesn't belong here." She rushed to explain that she had seen him several times before, walking around, never fitting in. There was no real evidence of a crime, but to Heather, that didn't matter. Marcus, with his crisp suit and confident demeanor, was guilty of looking out of place. The police arrived. When the police arrived, Heather was already standing outside, ready to confront Marcus. She pointed to him from across the street, not giving him a chance to explain himself. Marcus, who had been unaware of the watchful eyes on him, had no idea what was coming. The officers approached him with caution, but they were more focused on Heather's accusations than the man who had done nothing wrong. Heather led the charge, her self-righteousness apparent in every word. "That man," she began, "he looks illegal. I don't know what he's doing here, but I'm sure he's up to no good." Her words were baseless, but in Heather's mind, they were enough to condemn Marcus. She didn't need any more justification. Her discomfort alone was sufficient to convince her that something was wrong. As the officer questioned her, Heather stood by, watching Marcus, completely ignoring the fact that her own biases were driving her to make wild and unfounded accusations. Marcus, baffled and caught off guard, tried to explain that he was just on his way to a business meeting with a CEO. The fact that Marcus was meeting a CEO, someone important, someone successful, completely shattered Heather's assumptions about him. Marcus wasn't the criminal she had hoped to paint him as. He was successful, articulate, and, much to her horror, someone who belonged exactly where he was. But Heather couldn't accept that. Her discomfort had turned into an all-consuming need to make Marcus the villain in her story, no matter the truth. The turning point. The police didn't take long to respond. Within minutes, a patrol car pulled up at the corner of the street where Marcus had been standing just moments before his meeting was set to begin. It wasn't the kind of situation Marcus had ever imagined he would find himself in, standing there in a crisp suit, waiting to conduct a business deal, only to be interrupted by a call to the police. The officers, a male and a female, stepped out of the car, their expressions unreadable as they glanced over at Marcus. He stood on the sidewalk, confused but calm, wondering what was happening. He hadn't been doing anything wrong. He was simply trying to get to a business meeting. But Heather had already planted the seed of suspicion in their minds, and her accusatory finger was pointing directly at him. Marcus had no idea why he had been singled out or what he had done to warrant this kind of attention. Heather, seizing the moment, marched over to the officers, her face filled with a mix of self-righteousness and urgency. "There he is," she said, practically hissing the words. "I knew it. I knew something wasn't right about him. He's up to something illegal. Just look at him. He doesn't belong here." Her voice was shaking, filled with a venomous certainty that only served to intensify the tension in the air. Her eyes were locked onto Marcus, and her fingers were still pointed at him, as if she had discovered some great crime that no one else had noticed. The officers exchanged a brief, silent glance. Marcus could tell that they were sizing up the situation, trying to figure out exactly what they were walking into. They were experienced enough to know when things weren't adding up, but in this moment, they had to follow protocol. The female officer spoke first, trying to understand what had brought them here. "Can you explain what's going on?" she asked, her tone calm but firm. Before Marcus could respond, Heather was already speaking over her. "He looks illegal," Heather said, her words coming out in a rush. Her face was flushed with indignation, her body stiff with the belief that she was doing the right thing. She was certain that Marcus was guilty of something, though she couldn't quite articulate what that was. She didn't need to. Her mind had already made up the story, and in her world, that was enough. Marcus's eyes widened in shock and confusion. He was frozen for a moment, struggling to comprehend what had just been said. "He looks illegal?" Marcus repeated softly, his voice tinged with disbelief. He tried to make sense of it. How could anyone be accused of being illegal simply based on the way they looked? The color of his skin, his demeanor, his presence, it didn't matter to Heather. To her, Marcus's appearance alone was enough to label him as a criminal, regardless of the truth. The male officer looked at Heather, his expression hardening. Marcus could see the shift in the officer's demeanor. He wasn't buying it. He was trained to handle situations like this, but even he seemed uncomfortable with what Heather had just said. The words "he looks illegal" were as vague as they were prejudiced, and they didn't sit well with either officer. But for now, they had to keep their composure and address the situation. The silence that followed was thick. Heather stood there, certain that she was in the right, while Marcus remained bewildered, struggling to understand what was happening. The confusion that hung in the air finally gave way to Marcus's calm, yet firm response. He didn't raise his voice or panic. Instead, he simply stood his ground, trying to make sense of the absurd accusation. "I'm just here for a meeting," he began, his voice steady. "I'm meeting with the CEO to discuss business." Marcus's words were measured, his demeanor composed, but beneath the surface, he was fighting back a deep sense of frustration. How could this be happening? He had done nothing wrong, and yet here he was, being treated as if he were a criminal simply because of how he looked. For a brief moment, Heather's face faltered, and Marcus could see her shock. The reality of the situation was starting to clash with the narrative she had built in her mind. She had expected Marcus to be caught in some sort of illegal activity. She had thought he would be the type of person who would justify her suspicions, perhaps someone who would stammer, look guilty, or try to run. But Marcus wasn't doing any of that. He was calm, articulate, and confident. His success and composure in the face of her accusations completely threw Heather off balance. Her shock quickly turned into disbelief. She had painted Marcus as an intruder, someone who didn't belong, and now here he was, a man who was successful, professional, and meeting with a CEO. The words that Heather had expected to hear, confession, guilt, or nervousness, were nowhere to be found. Instead, Marcus was standing there, explaining that he was doing exactly what anyone else in the neighborhood might be doing, working, living his life, and succeeding. Heather's eyes widened, and her lips parted as she processed what Marcus had just said. How could he, of all people, be involved in something so legitimate? How could he be meeting with someone so important? For a moment, her mind struggled to process the truth. She had built up a story in her mind that Marcus was a threat, someone who didn't belong in her neighborhood, but now she was confronted with a reality that she couldn't deny. The truth was a bitter pill for Heather to swallow. Marcus's calm, self-assured demeanor shattered the image she had created of him. He wasn't the criminal she had hoped to expose. He was the very opposite. Marcus's success was the last thing she expected, and the realization that she had been so wrong infuriated her. Her face flushed with rage as her mind scrambled to maintain control over the situation. She couldn't accept that Marcus, a man she had tried so hard to label as an outsider, could be more successful and composed than she could ever imagine. For a split second, Heather's expression was one of stunned silence, but then her anger erupted. "I don't care what he says," she snapped, her voice growing louder and more hysterical. "This man doesn't belong here. He's nothing but trouble." Her words were a desperate attempt to regain some semblance of power in the situation, but deep down, Heather knew she had lost the battle. She had failed to make her case, and it was only a matter of time before her racism became painfully evident. The aftermath. The tension in the air grew thick with every passing moment. Marcus remained composed, still standing on the sidewalk as Heather continued to fume. Her words hung in the air like poison, her accusations still lingering, but the officers were no longer willing to entertain her baseless claims. The female officer, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke, her voice firm. "Ma'am, you can't just accuse someone like that with no evidence. What you've said is racist, and it's wrong." The male officer, who had remained stoic up to this point, now turned to Heather with a look of palpable disgust. His patience, already stretched thin by the absurdity of the situation, was wearing out fast. "You can't just treat someone like that," he added, his tone sharp. "What you've said is not only false, but it's also unacceptable." His eyes bore into Heather, who, despite being confronted with the reality of her actions, didn't seem to care. Instead, Heather's frustration boiled over into anger. She couldn't fathom that the officers weren't taking her side, that they were calling out her behavior for what it truly was. Her vision blurred with rage. She had called the police to act on her behalf, to confirm her view of Marcus as an outsider, a threat, but now it felt like she was the one under scrutiny, and the power she thought she held was slipping through her fingers. Her chest heaved with indignation, and she shook with fury. "Excuse me," Heather sneered. "How dare you defend him over me?" Her voice grew louder, shrill with outrage. She was no longer simply upset. She was ready to lash out at anyone who dared to question her. Before anyone could stop her, Heather lunged toward the male officer, her arms flailing as she tried to shove him away. The scene escalated rapidly. The officer was quick on his feet, his training taking over as he blocked her attempt and caught her by the arms. "You do not get to attack an officer," he snapped, his grip firm and unyielding. "Especially not over your own prejudices." Heather, now completely out of control, continued to struggle, thrashing in an attempt to break free. But the officer wasn't having it. His tone remained stern, filled with authority. In one swift motion, he pulled out his handcuffs and snapped them onto Heather's wrists, securing her with the cold metallic click. The sound of the cuffs echoed in the still air, a stark reminder of the consequences of her actions. Heather's face contorted in disbelief, relief, and fury as the officer restrained her. She had never imagined that she would find herself in this position, and the shock only fueled her anger. Her hands trembled with rage, and her chest heaved as she realized that her sense of control had completely slipped away. The neighborhood that she had once felt so entitled to was no longer her domain. It was now Marcus's as much as it was hers, and she couldn't accept that. The officers didn't waste any more time. They began guiding her toward the squad car, ignoring her desperate protests. Heather's eyes, wild with fury, fixed on Marcus as she was escorted away. "You're making a huge mistake," she screamed, her voice filled with venom. "You're both idiots." But her words had no weight now. She was no longer in control of the situation. The officers moved swiftly, unaffected by her ranting. Heather's attempts to break free were futile, her movements jerky and frantic as they forced her into the back of the police car. As the officer slammed the door behind her, the sound of her muffled screams echoed through the quiet neighborhood. Marcus stood still, processing everything. The calm he had maintained through the entire ordeal was now a little shaken, but he remained standing tall. He could hardly believe what had just transpired. Heather, a person who had once held so much power in this community, was now the one being carted off in handcuffs. The neighborhood, once home to Heather's self-appointed rule, now felt different. People began to gather in small groups, talking quietly amongst themselves. They had witnessed something no one could have predicted. Heather, the woman who had constantly tried to impose her views and prejudices on others, was finally facing the consequences of her actions. No one could escape the truth any longer. Her racism had led to this moment, and now the entire community had a front-row seat to her downfall. As the squad car pulled away, the weight of the situation began to sink in. Heather's shouts faded, but the impact of her actions would resonate long after she was gone. Her racist tirade, her baseless accusations, and her assault on the officers all led to one undeniable conclusion. She had crossed a line. The final reckoning. Inside the police car, Heather's anger continued to boil over. She had never been one to accept defeat, especially not when she believed her status and views were being challenged. As the car rumbled down the street, Heather continued her verbal assault, her voice rising in pitch as she spat out racial slurs with abandon. "You're nothing but an ape," she yelled, her words dripping with hatred. "A slave. You don't belong here. You never did." Her words were a grotesque reflection of her internalized racism, and she was no longer trying to hide them. But her hatred, no matter how loudly she shouted, wasn't going to change the fact that she had been caught in her own lie. The officers, who had once approached her with professionalism, were now silent, their attention focused on driving her to the nearest precinct. Heather was left to stew in her fury, her hateful words bouncing off the walls of the squad car, but they fell on deaf ears. The officers had seen this behavior before. They had dealt with people like Heather, individuals who believed their prejudice gave them power. But now, it was Heather who was powerless, and the officers knew it. Back on the street, Marcus stood motionless, still trying to comprehend the events that had unfolded. His mind raced with questions, but the answer was clear. The neighborhood he had moved into, the one he had hoped would be peaceful and welcoming, had turned out to be a battleground for Heather's racist ideals. But Marcus wasn't going to let that dictate his life. He was a man of substance, a man who had worked hard for everything he had, and no amount of prejudice or hatred from Heather could take that away. As Heather was driven away, the neighborhood began to take notice. People began to speak, the rumors started to spread, and the truth of Heather's actions became undeniable. Marcus's composure in the face of such cruelty had only magnified the ugliness of her behavior. People could now see who Heather truly was, a bigoted, entitled woman who thought she could dictate the lives of others based on her narrow view of the world. In the end, Heather's actions left her with nothing but a tarnished reputation and a criminal record. Her position in the community, once secure, had now been shattered. But Marcus walked away with his dignity intact. He had been unfairly targeted, but he had stood his ground, and in the end, that was all that mattered. As the officers continued their work, Marcus knew that the fight for respect and equality was far from over. But he had taken a small victory in this encounter, a victory that, in time, would have a ripple effect throughout the neighborhood.